Hello, my name is Angelo Joaquin, and I'm going to be doing my extra credit skull video for my Biology 180 class. And we're going to start off with the sutures first. So there's the skull right here. So we have the coronal suture right here. Oh my god, get away. Coronal suture right here. Goes across. Then we have the sagittal suture right here, which splits the parietal bones. And then on the back, this triangle suture right here is the lambdoid suture, right here. That splits from the sagittal suture. That's the lambdoid suture right there. And then on the side right here, we have the squamous suture right there. Moving on to the frontal bone, you have the supraorbital margins, which are the margins across along the orbital up here on either side. And then the supraorbital notches or foramen are the notches right there. This is foramen. There's not a notch on this skull, but there's foramen right here, and then right there. And then the superciliary arches are the arches right here. You can kind of see them. They're like, I like to call them the eyebrows of the skull. You can see them more protruding on the side, right here, the superciliary arches. But they're bumps right above the supraorbital margins. Next is the glabella. It's this flat bone right here where the forehead should be. Right there, that's where the glabella is. And then the anterior cranial fossa. You have to remove the skull for this. The anterior cranial fossa is this first part right here. That's the anterior cranial fossa. Moving on to the parietal bones. This is the top of the skull that we removed. So it would look like this. The parietal bones are the two bones separated right here by the sagittal suture. These are the parietal bones. Moving on to the temporal bones. The mastoid process is the bump right here. Right here. This is the mastoid process. And then the squamous part is right here, this flat part, right underneath the squamous suture. This is the squamous part. The zygomatic arch is this arch right here, the handle of the skull right here. That's the zygomatic arch. The external acoustic meatus is this hole right here. This is the external acoustic meatus. Then the mandibular fossa. So for this skull, I can't really remove the jaw because it's screwed on. But the mandibular fossa are right here and right here. They're the fossa that the mandible goes into. So they would be right there. And then right here, too, would be the mandibular fossa. Next is the styloid process. It's right there. The stiletto heel right next to the mastoid process, the styloid process, and you can see it across right there too. So this is the styloid process right there. And then the stylomastoid foramen would be the foramen in between the processes. So it would be right there, right where the tip is. Because this is the styloid process and this is the mastoid process. So it would be the stylomastoid process because it's in between both of them. Sorry, stylomastoid foramen would be right in between them, not the process. Stylomastoid foramen. And then the jugular fossa would be you can see it better on the inside of the skull. Sorry. The jugular fossa, jugular fossa would be right there. Sorry. Let's knock them out right now. What I was pointing to was the jugular foramen. The inside of the skull. These are the jugular foramen on each side, right there and right there. And if I put my little pointer sword through, you can see that's the jugular foramen right there, and right next to it, see that depression or groove? That's the jugular fossa right here, next to the jugular foramen. This is the fossa, right where the tip is dragging along. That's the jugular fossa. And then the hole is the foramen, which I just showed you. Again, right here and right there. The carotid canal is this canal right there, where the sword is dragging along. This is the carotid canal. there. And then the petrous part are these nice mountain ridges that I'm dragging along. These are the petrous parts, right here and right here. Petrous parts. And then the internal acoustic meatus, if you follow it, actually, I can't poke the sword through, but if you follow the external, you'll actually see, there's a good angle of it. This is the internal acoustic meatus, right there. Where the tip is, right there. That's the internal acoustic meatus. Same thing on the other side, right there. The zygomatic process is this part right here, the arch. The zygomatic process. Now specifically, I'm gonna knock it out right now. This area right here, going up here, you can't really see because there would be a line right here, but this area right here on the arch is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And then it would be cut right here, and then this part right here, in this area, would be the temporal process of the zygomatic bone in the whole arch here. So temporal process of the zygomatic bone, zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And then the middle cranial fossa is this middle part right here. Just cut in the middle cranial fossa. Moving on to the occipital. The external occipital protuberance is the bump on the back right here. That's the external occipital protuberance right there. And then the superior nuchal line, if you can see, my sword will point it out, the M kind of shape right there, that's the superior nuchal line right along there. And then moving on to the foramen magnum is the giant hole where the spine is going to go. Foramen magnum. Then the occipital condyles are on the side right here. These little bumps right here. This is where the atlas is going to sit, the occipital condyles. They're right next to the foramen magnum. The internal occipital protuberance, going right here, is the little bump right there. This is the internal occipital protuberance. And then the internal occipital crest is the crest, following right underneath the internal protuberance. And then the posterior cranial fossa is the posterior cranial fossa right there. The back part, this whole back part is the posterior cranial fossa. And the hypoglossal canal is right next to the foramen magnum. Right there and right there. The hypoglossal canal. Right there and right there. Moving on to the sphenoid, we have the lesser wings right there and right there. These are the lesser wings, this whole area up here. And then the greater wings, you can't really tell in the skull, is right there and right there. This whole area down here are the greater wings. The sella turcica is the Turkish chair in the middle, sella turcica, right there. The posterior and anterior clinoid processes. So let's start with the anterior. The anterior clinoid processes are these fangs right here. The nice little fangs. I like to think of them as like fangs, you know, vampire teeth. Anterior clinoid processes. And then the posterior clinoid processes are the top of the Turkish chair. This is the posterior clinoid processes right here and right there, right there, and right there. There, right there. And then moving on, we have the optic canal, which you can't really see on the skull. You see there's like no hole there, but the optic canal would be in that hole. Hold on, how can I do this? There we go. It would be right there. The optic canal would be right there, but on this skull it's not really well made, so but the optic canal would be right there. And then the superior and inferior orbital fissures, you can see because they're, you know, cut out. Here's the superior orbital fissure, and then the inferior orbital fissure. Kind of makes like a V shape. And then the optic canal would be through there. On a real skull, you'd be able to tell, but this one just has the orbital fissures. The foramen rotundum is right there. Usually, you know, you could use the optic canal as a guide to find the rotundum, but I don't have the optic canal, sadly, but here's the rotundum. And then moving on, we have the foramen ovale, where the sword's going to go through. This is the ovale right here. This is the ovale. And then we have the foramen lacerum right next to the Turkish chair, sella turcica. This is the foramen lacerum, where the sword is going through. That's the lacerum right here. And then foramen spinosum. It's not even cut out well. Let's see if I can poke through it. I can't. It's right underneath the ovale where the sword is right now. This is the foramen spinosum right here. So ovale spinosum. And then the is that the petrous parts? The pterygoid process, I think that's how to pronounce. The pterygoid processes are right here. Pterygoid processes right here and right here. And then moving on to the ethmoid bone, we have the cristagalli, which is, actually I can point the skull right here. This is the cristagalli right here, the rooster's crest, cristagalli. And then cribiform plates. Yeah, cribiform plates. And then the olfactory foramen of the ethmoid bone are on here, on the cribiform plates, but I don't think that's part of the list. Yeah, it's not. And then the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone is this nice perpendicular plate right here that the sword is pointing to. And then the vomer bone is down here too, just to knock that out. And then perpendicular plate. And then the middle nasal conchae are the ones on the top. Right there and right there. And the inferior nasal conchae are right there and right there. So middle nasal conchae, inferior nasal conchae, perpendicular plate, vomer bone. Pretty sure I knocked some of that. Yeah, middle nasal conchae, perpendicular plate, inferior. Okay, moving on to the mandible. The body is the whole thing. The whole thing is the body. And then the mental foramen are the foramen on the mental, which is the chin. Sorry, my pants are in the way. The mental foramen right here and right here. There and right there. And then the mental tubercles, you can't really tell on this skull, but they're the nice, would be the bumps on the mental. One would be right here, one would be right here, the mental tubercles. And the condylar process is the process that actually goes into the mandibular fossa. So here, the condylar process right here. This is the condylar process. And then the mandibular notch following here. This is the mandibular notch. And then the coronoid process is the sharp process right here. This is the coronoid process right here. Woo. And then the ramus, if you cut it like right here, if I cut that, that's the ramus. This whole part right here is the ramus. If I cut that, you have the ramus. And then the alveolar processes are where the margins are here. These are the alveolar processes along the teeth, the gums, essentially, alveolar processes. And then the mandibular foramen are on the inside of the mandible. These are the mandibular foramen. Let's see if I can point it on a different angle. Right there. This other side's better. This is the mandibular foramen. And I could stick the sword in there. Mandibular foramen. And already went. The nasal bone is this bone on the top right here. This is the nasal bone. And then the lacrimal bone, the lacrimal fossa, and the nasolacrimal canal. You can't really tell on this bone, or in this skull, sadly, but the lacrimal bone's right here, and then the lacrimal fossa would be right there. I think I can tell better on this side. Yeah, there. Lacrimal fossa and the nasolacrimal canal would be there. And then moving on to the zygomatic, I already said the temporal process earlier, and then the palatine bone. The palatine bone right here, move on this side. The palatine bone is right here. The horizontal plate is right there. Horizontal plate of the palatine bone right here. And then moving on to the maxilla, the incisive fossa is the fossa right there where the sword's pointing. This is the incisive fossa. And then the palatine process is this whole process right here. This is the whole process, the palatine process. All the way up until the palatine bone. This is the palatine process. And then the anterior nasal spine. Better if you see it on the side. This is the anterior nasal spine right there. If I can just turn it right here too. Anterior nasal spine right here. Better to see on the side though. The infraorbital foramen, or the foramen right underneath the orbitals, hence infraorbital. So infraorbital foramen right there and right there. There and there. And then the alveolar processes, again, right here. The top. And right here too. Alveolar processes. And then the hyoid. Obviously, I don't have the hyoid bones with me, so. But that's it. Thanks for watching. My name's Angelo Joaquin. I'm signing off.